Good afternoon, and welcome to the Covington branch of the Kenton County Public Library. My name is John Graham. I'm the Adult Services Coordinator here at the Covington branch. You're here today for a wonderful program presented called Margaret Garner, The Mystery Behind the Murder. Our presenter is someone who's well known to the Covington community and the library as well. I'd like to welcome Kareem K.A. Simpson, who's a social innovator, community enthusiast, serial entrepreneur, self-published author, foodie, and one who's obsessed with all things creative. How's that for an introduction? Raised in Covington, he's a 95 graduate of Holmes High School. He moved back to the greater Cincinnati area in 2001 after a career as a Korean linguist in the U.S. Army, where he began Bookmark Online, which is now Sparklight Creative Group, a small personal and professional development company. In 2013, Kareem he self-published his first fiction book, Chronicles of a Boy Misunderstood, and began Pub Inc., which is Cincinnati's first book publishing incubator. Currently, he runs Sparklight and is a contributing writer for the River City News and Soapbox Cincinnati. And in addition to that, Kareem is a very good friend of the Public Library of Kenton County. He's a former staff member here, and he's done programs for us on topics from writing a resume to publishing your book. This program is one of dozens that the Kenton County Library offers throughout the county at our 3 different branches. If you'd like to visit us online at kentonlibrary.org or a program calendar to access for more information, you're welcome to do so. I do want to mention one of the upcoming programs we have is a book discussion group of the book Beloved by Toni Morrison. This takes place this Wednesday, February 14th at noon at the Covington Library. Copies of the book are available in the table behind us. For the audience in person and the audience on TV, this program is being broadcast live on TBNK. It is on Spectrum Channel 200 and also FiOS Channel 819. This program will be archived and redistributed on tbnk.org in the next 1 to 2 weeks or so. So again, I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Kareem Simpson. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that great introduction, and thank you for the Kenton County Public Library for having me. Kenton County Public Library is a great resource for the area, and one of my first jobs coming out of high school, so thank you, Kenton County Public Library. And thank you guys for braving this kind of cold, ugly day outside to come and listen to me talk about Margaret Garner, one of the area's great heroines, and her story should be told and will continue to be told. So let's start off. In 1987, Ohio-born writer Toni Morrison published Beloved. The famous novel tells stories of the former slave Sethi and her daughter living in post-Civil War Cincinnati. Those familiar with the story know that Sethi's history is a dark one, in which she kills her own daughter and tries to kill her own 3 children when a group of men find her in Cincinnati and attempt to take her back to Sweet Home, the plantation in northern Kentucky from which she recently escaped. So if you can see by the slide, has anyone read Beloved, or kind of know the? Okay, it's a great story. I picked it up when I was in high school, and after actually the movie came out, and I saw the movie and said, well, that looks like Cincinnati. Like, how come I don't know this story? It went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1988. National Book Award finalist in 1987, a motion picture, as I mentioned before, in 1998, made into an opera in 2005. Not many books have done that. And the New York Times Survey of Writers and Literary Critics ranked it the best work of American fiction from 1981 to 2006. So that's pretty good. And a lot of people know that the heroine of the story is actually Margaret Garner, who has local ties. Before we dive into Beloved's true story, let's take a quick look at how it was to live in the area during slavery. During the 19th century, Cincinnati was a boomtown. The Ohio River provided Cincinnati residents with numerous business opportunities. Hotels, restaurants, and taverns quickly opened to meet the needs of settlers traveling westward on the Ohio River. Steamboats were manufactured and repaired here in the city. Farmers brought their crops to the city to send down the Ohio-Mississippi rivers to New Orleans, Louisiana, one of Ohio's major markets. The Miami-Erie Canal, which flowed downtown, made the trip from western Ohio to Cincinnati much easier and less expensive for local farmers. In the early 1800s, Cincinnati developed into an important meatpacking center. Farmers brought their livestock to the city, where it was slaughtered, processed, and sold to Western settlers or shipped to various markets. Cincinnati was becoming the pork processing center of the United States. Because of Cincinnati's association with meatpacking, the city became known as Porkopolis of the United States. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm going to say Cincinnati, but you know that we really mean the greater Cincinnati area. Just so that you don't think that I'm sliding Northern Kentucky. I'm from Covington, so I can't slide it. So. This region also played an important role in the intellectual and cultural development of Ohio and Kentucky during the first half of the 19th century. In 1819, Daniel Drake established the Medical College of Ohio in Cincinnati, hoping to improve the medical care. Numerous literary figures, including Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, actually lived in Cincinnati as well. Now, beginning in the 1830s, ethnic Germans began to settle in Cincinnati. German and Irish immigrants mixed with Americans from both North and South to create a very diverse worldly population. Pictured here is one of Cincinnati's most esteemed pastimes. Here's an ad for Mulhauser Brewing Company from the time in the late 1800s. The brewery was founded in 1866 in Cincinnati by Conrad Windisch and Gottlieb and Heinrich Mühlhauser. So I don't speak German, so I probably butchered those names, but hopefully I got them close enough. But the brewery was later known as Lion Brewery and later the Burger Brewing Company. Ohio abolitionists also concentrated their efforts in Cincinnati. Because it was located directly across the Ohio River from Kentucky, a slaveholding state, Cincinnati was an ideal site to publish newspapers and anti-slavery tracts to send to the South. And you can see on the right-hand side there's actually a call. This was a flyer that was sent out and posted around the area to kind of promote the abolitionist movement. This location, Cincinnati, also meant that many fugitive slaves traveled across the Ohio River and through the city toward potential freedom in the north. And as you can see, there's large swaths. This is a map of the paths that a lot of African Americans took to escape slavery. And you see there's large swaths on the eastern seaboard. I feel like I'm a weatherman going through. On the eastern seaboard and up through Philadelphia, but you can also see there's a huge swath going through our region of northern Kentucky and southern Ohio. Antebellum Cincinnati played a large role in the abolitionist movement, partially due to its location as a major city in the free state of Ohio, directly across the river from the slave state of Kentucky, but mostly due to economic prowess and wealth of opportunity that Cincinnati held, making the Queen City a major migration path for escaped slaves. Leading abolitionists such as Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, James Birney, Salmon P Chase, Levi Coffin, and Theodore Weld frequently spoke and wrote in support of freeing the slaves. Several locations in the region were alleged to be stops on the Underground Railroad. Debates were held at the Lane Theological Seminary, fueled the anti-slavery controversy. And there is a small statue on the riverside over here in Covington of James Bradley. Has everyone seen that the lone black man sitting on a bench? So that's James Bradley, and he attended the Lane Seminary College, and he was instrumental in these Lane debates. He was the first African American to be allowed to attend that college. So it's great that we have a monument of him. Did you have a question?
Where is the Lane Seminary?
It was located in Walnut Hills on Gilbert Avenue, around that area. So I want to say there used to be a car lot there. So there's a plaque. Okay, so right on Gilbert Avenue. It's obviously it's not there any longer, but that's where it was located. Though Cincinnati was on the path to freedom for many African Americans escaping slavery, not everyone was an abolitionist. Abolitionists often encountered local resistance, including violent actions and those with opposing viewpoints. So many of these people feared that if slavery ended, they would face competition from the freed African Americans. Race riots sometimes occurred, especially if whites feared that African Americans were gaining too much power or were infringing upon white opportunities. So this is a picture. It's kind of grainy, but this is a drawing of the Cincinnati riots that occurred in 1829. Now, during the Civil War, many businesses supported the Union Army. And of course, Procter & Gamble is one of the largest businesses that did that. The two founders might not have met if they had not married sisters, Olivia and Elizabeth Norris. Their new father-in-law actually suggested that they become business partners, and in 1837, the Procter & Gamble Company was born. With intentions of heading farther west than they managed, William Procter, immigrating from England, and James Gamble, immigrating from Ireland, settled in Cincinnati, considered that at that time to be the Queen City of the West. In 1862, 25 years later, after the partnership was formed, and after reaching more than $1 million in sales, and during the Civil War, Procter & Gamble actually was awarded contracts to supply soap and candles to the Union armies. Now, the fact that Procter & Gamble supplied soldiers enhanced the company's reputation for heavy-duty quality. It was also reinforced with troops when they came home from the war carrying P&G soaps among their belongings. Not only that, Cincinnati was also a major recruitment city for the war. Cincinnati served as a major recruiting organization center for the United States military during the Civil War. The city's businesses thrived as they provided supplies for the soldiers and housing for both the soldiers and the families. Various charity organizations also arrived in the city to help soldiers and their families, including the United States Sanitary Commission and the United States Christian Commission. Now, Cincinnati had mixed political views. Many of the city's swelling immigrant population, including Germans, embraced the fledgling Republican Party. In 1859, Abraham Lincoln made his first political visit to Cincinnati, where he challenged presidential hopeful Stephen Douglas's views on slavery. The political editor of the Cincinnati Daily Gazette later wrote the positive biography, The Life of Abraham Lincoln, which was used as a campaign propaganda during Abraham Lincoln's 1860 presidential campaign. The Cincinnati Daily Times, a Democratic newspaper, openly supported the South's right to succeed. And this is a picture of Lincoln, or a lithograph of Lincoln speaking in Cincinnati. And I want to say it's Fountain Square, but it actually looks like it's near Findlay Market.
No, it's Fifth Street
It's
Market.
Fifth Street Market? Okay.
Yeah, they didn't take that down until, they were putting in Fountain.
Gotcha. It didn't have a reference to where it was a lithograph of, so thank you for that.
I've seen photographs of that building later.
Which one, the Hancock
Hanging
Rocks?
Foundry.
Okay. Hanging Rocks, not Hancock Rocks. Not that. By 1890, Cincinnati had become an important industrial, political, literary, and educational center for both Ohio and all of the United States. Cincinnati was the largest city in Ohio with almost 300,000 people. Cincinnati had the densest population of any city in the United States with an average of 37,000 people per square mile. More than 15 railroads connected Cincinnati to other parts of the United States. The major industry in Cincinnati was iron production, followed closely by meatpacking, cloth production, and woodworking. Cincinnati's industries employed 103,000 people in 1887 and produced more than $200 million in goods. Roughly 130 newspapers and magazines met the literary needs of the people. The public library had a collection of more than 80,000 books. Cincinnati had an art museum, an art academy, as well as an opera house and the music hall and exposition building. The University of Cincinnati provided residents with access to college education. The city contained more than 200 churches, and it also had 5 hospitals. So this is pretty big in the 1800s. And if you can take a look at the slide, the population wasn't that big until there was a huge spike in 1840. And between 1840 and 1860, it nearly doubled in population, and then it just went up from there. I don't know what happened in the 50s. So I guess people got tired of coming to Cincinnati. But it was a major time. It was a major time for population. It was a boomtown. So all of that kind of gives you the landscape of what was going on in the mid-1800s, late 1800s. Not only did you have a booming political scene, you had a booming business scene, you had people that didn't know whether they were for slavery or against slavery. You had a lot of people coming over, freeing slaves, so it was just a hodgepodge time to be there. It sounds exciting. I wouldn't want to be there at the time, but I'm sure a lot of people had, it was an exciting time for a lot of people. Now, by the end of, Cincinnati also played a major role in Ohio government as well. By the end of the 1880s, the city had provided Ohio with 13 governors, including Othniel Luker, Ethan Allen Brown, Salmon Chase, William Dennison, John Brough, Charles Anderson, Jacob Cox, Rutherford Hayes, Edward Nose, Richard Bishop, George Hoadley, Thomas Young, and Joseph Foraker. And this is a picture of actually Ulysses S. Grant in Cincinnati. And the picture didn't reference where that was here in Cincinnati, but it's obviously a drawing. Now, this is what you all came here. Kind of the unraveling. Why did Margaret Garner leave? Well, we kind of knew why she escaped. And what was the whole turmoil? There were a lot of people escaping slavery at the time. What made her story so unique and gripped the attention of our nation so wildly? Now, best known as the inspiration for Toni Morrison's award-winning novel, Beloved, the Margaret Garner incident in 1856 contains one of the most groundbreaking fugitive slave trials of the pre-Civil War era. Margaret Garner was born into slavery on June 4th, 1834 on Maplewood Plantation in Boone County, Kentucky. Working as a house slave for much of her life, Garner often traveled with her masters and even accompanied them on shopping trips to free territories in Cincinnati, Ohio. And the picture on the left is actually a photograph from the opera Margaret Garner, and Maplewood, AKA Sweet Home as it is in the book Beloved, was located in Boone County, Richwood, Kentucky. This is an actual picture of the barn where Margaret lived. I think remnants of it still remain. I'm not sure if the entire barn is still standing. In my research, I couldn't tell if it was there or not. But I do know that there was a push a few years ago to actually raise raise funds to keep it there. I don't know if it actually succeeded. After marrying Robert Garner in 1849, Margaret bore 4 children by 1856. The 1850s were also a period which the Underground Railroad was at its height in and around Cincinnati, transporting numerous slaves to freedom in Canada. The Garners decided to take advantage of such an opportunity and to escape enslavement. On Sunday, January 27th, in 1856, they set out for their first stop on the route to freedom, Joseph Kite's house in Cincinnati. Joseph Kite was a cousin of theirs. He had just recently been freed, and he lived in the Mill Creek area of Cincinnati. So there were 2 major African-American areas in downtown Cincinnati. There was Mill Creek Valley, which now is a railroad and highway, and then there was Boomtown, which was kind of at the end of where the canal kind of exited into the Ohio River. And so Joseph Kite lived in the Mill Creek area. The Garners made it safely to Kite's home on Monday morning, where they awaited their next guide. Within hours, the Garners' master, A.K. Gaines, and federal marshals stormed Kite's home with warrants for the Garners. Determined not to return to slavery, Margaret decided to take the lives of herself and her children. When the marshals found Margaret in the back room, she had slit her 2-year-old daughter's throat with a butcher knife and killing her. The other children lay on the floor and wounded, but still alive. This is a painting by Thomas Noble Satterwhite, is one of the most famous depictions of this horrific event. Satterwhite's well-known works are largely historical or social/political presentations. He is best known for a series of 4 anti-slavery paintings. The first, called Last Sale of Slave in 1865, depicted the scene of the last sale of the slaves on the St. Louis courthouse steps. He followed this painting with John Brown's Blessing in 1866, which depicted the abolitionist activist John Brown being led to his execution and blessing a child on the steps of the courthouse. His third painting, and most popular, The Modern Medea, was created in 1867. This portrayed the tragic event from 1856. The picture is notable for Garner's expression of rage and for including the white slave hunters in the imagery. Noble's last painting, Price of Blood in 1868, was not based on a specific historical event, but depicted white slave owners selling his half-white son. Margaret's actions made national news, and in 1856, that wasn't easy to do. Now, the fact that Margaret sacrificed her beloved child rather than see them ushered back to slavery was not the only thing that gripped the nation. So when Margaret took the life of her children, it was, you would think that would be murder, right? She would be charged with murder. Well, at the time, remember, African Americans weren't seen as people. They were seen as objects, as possessions. So the original thing, everyone thought, okay, she's going to be charged with robbery. The abolitionists pushed for murder, the larger of the two. And of course, that's backward thinking to us. If you do something so heinous, okay, I want to be charged with murder. But they wanted Margaret to be charged with murder so that she can be considered a person, as opposed to just being charged with theft. So she would, and then she would be continually to be considered an object. So it's kind of reverse thinking, but it made sense in there, in the abolitionist thinking, and it made sense to me as well. The Cincinnati slave case, as it was sometimes called, was reported upon by newspapers all over the United States, but the coverage was particularly strong in Ohio newspapers. And these are just a couple of clippings that I found of the case. You see the one on the left, the arrest of fugitive slaves, and then you have the anti-slavery bugle on the right, and that is from is that from Salem? Is it Salem? Yeah. So you have different parts of the country covering the story. Some were horrified by what transpired, but others regarded Margaret as a heroine. And this is a quote from one of the papers. Robert and Margaret fought bravely and desperately to protect themselves, their parents and their children, and their right for liberty. Now, this was reported in the Salem Anti-Slavery Bugle on December the 27th, 1856. The article goes on to say, such a deed excited universal horror and much sympathy. But some trembled as they reflected upon what must have been the sufferings of a woman who would rather take the lives of their children with their own hands than should they go back to that condition in which she had passed all her days. I couldn't imagine making that decision and actually having to make that decision. And that's one of the reasons that this story has gripped me so much, is that anyone put that in that position tells you how bad a situation an institution is where a person would have to make that decision. The fugitive slave hearing that followed was the longest of its era, lasting almost a month, as a judge deliberated over whether the Garners were to be tried as persons and charged with murder or tried as property under the Fugitive Slave Act. Her defense attorneys argued the former option. If charged with murder, Margaret Garner could be tried in a free state and later be pardoned for the crime. But the good news is that Margaret had some heavy hitters on her side.
I have a question.
Sure.
The article that said child, did she kill more than one of her children?
She killed one child.
Just
Yeah, she only killed one child.
Okay.
And she tried to take the life of another, but it didn't. But she was caught, or she was apprehended before that happened.
Was she tried in Ohio? Ohio was a free state where it occurred? Or
We're going to get to it. That's where it comes. That's the good stuff.
because I saw the movie, read the book, looked it up, so that's
So
my
remind me in the book. So the book, and I think they're going to talk about this a little bit on next week at the book discussion. The book kind of occurs, was it 40 years, 30 years after this event? So it occurs in the late 1800s. And they don't really mention what happened to her in the book or the movie. They know that she killed her child. This is in the book. And the ghost of the child comes back to haunt her. So they don't really pick up that in the book or in the movie. I don't know what they do in the opera. I didn't see it, but hopefully it will come back to Cincinnati. So we're talking about Margaret Garner's heavy hitters. So she had some big people on her side. One of those who were gunning for the murder charge was Salmon P Chase. At the time, he was the governor of Ohio, and then went on to be the United States Senator, United States Secretary of Treasury, and a Chief Justice of the United States. Chase was a strong abolitionist, known for defending escaped slaves and those who were arrested for helping them. He argued against the constitutionality of the Fugitive Slave Act before the U.S. Supreme Court in Jones versus Van Zandt in 1847, in which a Kentucky slave owner sought compensation from an Ohio abolitionist and Underground Railroad conductor for the cost of recovering escaped slaves. Although Chase argued that Van Zandt could not be found guilty of aiding a fugitive slave because slavery was illegal in Ohio, the court ruled against him and forced Van Zandt to pay damages. Now, the Garners were taken into custody and tried in what became one of the longest fugitive slave trials in history. And they were tried in Ohio. So they were actually tried in Ohio. Now, during this 2-week trial, abolitionist and lawyer John Joliffe argued that Margaret's trips to the free territory in Cincinnati entitled her and her children to freedom. Although Joliffe provided compelling arguments, the judge denied the Garner's plea for freedom and returned to the Gaines. So they were tried, and they were tried as not for murder, but for theft, and they were sent back to the plantation in which they escaped. Now, these are actual documents from the court case, and they're handwritten notes. The one on the right is actually a note to Salmon P Chase, urging him to get involved with the case, and the document on the left is a document from the court case. These are a couple that I found. I couldn't find the entire documents, but these are just some examples of those documents. Now, the Hamilton County grand jury indicted Garner and her husband on murder charges. So they were charged with murder. So after they were sent back, they went on ahead and retried the case without them, and they were charged with murder. A United States commission then ordered the Garners released from jail and returned their owner. So they weren't tried. Hamilton County went back and said, well, now that the first trial was done, they wanted to try them for murder. So that way they could get them back. They made the decision to get them to bring them back after they had been already sent back to the Gaines. A federal district judge agreed with the commissioner and ordered the Hamilton County Sheriff to turn the Garners over to the United States Marshal to return the slaves to the owner. A probate judge from Hamilton County tried to intervene, but the federal marshal had already transported the Garners back to their owner in Kentucky. Governor Chase demanded that Kentucky's governor immediately return the Garners to Ohio so that they could stand trial on murder charges. Chase did not want the precedent to be set that would allow Kentucky slave owners to come to Ohio and reclaim fugitive slaves. Now, once she's given back to her to her slave owners, the accounts of her life vary dramatically. One account says that the Garner's owners then sold the family to a slaveholder in New Orleans. On the family's trip to New Orleans, the steamboat that Garner was traveling upon collided with another. One of Margaret Garner's other children drowned in that accident. That's one account. The second account is that the Garners were sent to several different plantations before finally setting on a plantation in Arkansas with his brother. That's another account. The third account is that Margaret died of typhoid epidemic very shortly after they were sent back. What does this tell you? They did not want Margaret Garner to be tried again, because they knew that she was going to be charged appropriately, and the slave owners did not want that to happen. Now, whatever the case, Margaret Garner's story lives on in programs like these, in the work of Toni Morrison, and in a series of books that I've written called "The Chronicles of a Boy Misunderstood," like John said earlier, and the second book, "A Covenant's Lament." So those books that I've written, and also with Toni Morrison, they all have Margaret Garner kind of intertwined in it, talking about Greater Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. So that is my presentation. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will go ahead and take questions.
How accurate would you say Stephen Weisenberger's book is?
I haven't read his book.
You haven't? Modern Media?
Would they say that again?
Modern Media.
Okay.
Stephen Weiss. I mean, he accounts, he has, all those documents
Mm-hmm.
of the courts. He accounts all the wrangling
So when I give this presentation next year, I'm going to have that answer for you.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, because I read it a couple of times, I think it's.
What do you think? What do you think?
Well,
are-
it's very detailed.
Is it balanced? Do you think?
Well, I think he was out to tell the true story.
Good.
I mean, I was so curious after I read and saw Beloved,
Mm-hmm.
and then I thought, wonder if this is true. So I looked it up and I saw in the paper about references. So I read his book and I thought, oh my goodness, this is really interesting.
Yeah, it's very
And
interesting.
they talk about the other farms across,
Mm-hmm.
like across the street. I mean, if you go look.
Well, his
Maplewood,
Margaret Garner's husband was from a neighboring
Yes.
So they were.
across the road.
And they lived, well, across the road was probably, 3 miles or something like that, so probably,
Well, there's a lot of
yeah,
land,
right,
but
a
the
mile.
house is really nice.
But they met the night that they left and then escaped. She sent her children first. So the children were already there. They made, I don't know who they left with, but it was an entire family that left. So it wasn't just Margaret and her husband. It was her children and also, I think, her parents or one of the parents of the two. So it was a major, and the river was frozen. That's how they got across. That's how I got across the river, because the suspension bridge wasn't built till 10 years later, in 65 or 69 or something like that. Yeah, so it wasn't built until then. So, and they couldn't just hire a ferry to take them across the river. So they had to wait until they knew the river was going to freeze, and they made the journey.
And what they think was a mistake is that her husband, you know, they took the sled all the way down from Richwood down 25.
Mm-hmm.
And then he didn't want to burden the horses anymore, so he stopped at 6th Street in Covington around Mother of God. And they, you know, that slowed them down. They walked from there across the river
Mhm.
instead of taking
I haven't read
the
that,
sleigh.
but if
That's
they
who Miser
if they
Murray-
came all the way down from Richwood to 6th Street, I would say just go ahead and go to 6th Street for the horses. So
one would
you would
think
think
it'd
so,
be-
but they might have been the horses may have been, like you said, too difficult. Did you have a question?
Something what's on right now.
Oh, sorry.
Are your books in the library here?
They're not yet,
Yeah.
so I'm still working on that.
Okay. Has everybody here seen the mural on the wall down at the flood wall?
Mm. It depicts.
It's the picture of Margaret and her family getting ready to cross the river. It's one of the murals on the flood wall right down the street.
So she actually.
Close to the suspension or what?
Yeah, right beyond, yeah, if you
Yeah.
go down to the suspension bridge and turn to the left, and there's a whole lineup of the history of Covington on the flood wall.
Right.
Those murals are gorgeous.
Did you have a question?
Well, I have a couple comments.
Okay.
One, in term, sold down the river.
So
When they had problems with the slave up around here, they would sell them to deep south, so that's the term, sold down the river. Another comment, I was in the Boomtown Historical Society back in the 60s, and they had a gentleman who was older in goddamn named George Cook, who knew some of these people who were involved with Margaret Garner at the Gage, at the Gaines farm.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that was not brought out, that Gaines built a one-room schoolhouse for the black slaves to learn how to read and write.
Really?
And he doesn't get credit. It's right there by the Presbyterian Church
Oh, really?
on Richwood Road.
Well, I will look that up.
Now, was it the same was it Archibald?
Because there were a lot of
Or
Gaineses.
the?
Well,
one of
Archibald
the
Sons.
brothers?
There was.
Oh, well, that's different,
Okay.
yeah.
But Archibald Sons, one of them, John, was the territorial governor of Oregon when the president.
Okay.
It was the family was very involved politically.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, there were a lot of Gaines in Boone County at that time. Did you have a question?
One of the questions that I have a lot of data, I haven't read it yet, I wish I had had time to read it right now, but one of the legends that I always, and I've actually read it in print, but I didn't know if it was true, that Margaret, one of the precipitating factors
That I have not read.
Another child, have you ever heard?
I have not read that, but I had read that's that her children may have been fathered by her owner. Yeah. So I've never read that she was pregnant at the time.
Or suspected that
Right.
she was pregnant, and that this relationship, this complication of involvement with either her owner or someone in his family
Right.
was something, you know, that you can imagine, if it were true,
Right.
that was irritant in the marriage, and part of the impetus for them really wanting to get away from this unpleasant, because she and her husband didn't live together.
Right. They were in separate plantations.
Somewhere I've read or heard that the Gaines were ready to sell some of them
Yeah.
downriver.
Mm.
And because they, wanted to stay together as a family, it pushed them to run
That
away.
was- Yeah, and I did not read that, but
I heard that
but
somewhere or read it or.
does anyone have any more questions?
And I
Yeah.
heard the only child of her husband was the oldest, and the rest were
Oh wow.
Archibald.
Well, every presentation, I always ask one thing of my audience, and that's to take a selfie with me. So what I want you to do, just I want you just to say cheese and wave whenever. 1, 2, 3. Hey! That's really exciting, guys. I don't think. Hold on. Let me try it one more time. I'm going to get it one more time. There we go. 1, 2, 3. Cheese! There we go. Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. More to come. Thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you all for coming. Again, this is one of the many programs put on by the Canton County Library System. As Kareem mentioned, or if you didn't know, especially for those folks watching on TBNK right now, we are just a half mile, a few blocks away from where Margaret Garner would have escaped to freedom. As was mentioned a couple times during the talk, Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, is a real classic. If you haven't read this before or had a chance to discuss it, the Covington Library is hosting a book discussion this Wednesday, February 14th on Valentine's Day at noon. I've got copies in the back for you there. And again, this program has been broadcast live on TBNK, on Spectrum and FiOS, and then will be rebroadcast and archived on tbnk.org for future reference. So thank you all for coming today. Thank you. That always happens. It's funny because we have those, and speakers always want them, and we put them out, and people put them in their pocket, and we never get them back.
Really? Oh,
So
that's
we
not
stopped
good.
offering them because they always go missing.
Thank you.
Mr. Cook, Mr. Cook, I told you that
Yeah.
his old guy, he knew a lot of those people that were involved.
Yeah, there's a really old African